The war drum stood taller than any man in the camp, its skin stretched tight and dark from years of use. Tonight, under torchlight, King Draven Ashcombe stared at a small red mark pressed into that skin, a handprint, fresh and unexplained, and his fists tightened with a fury he could not name. He had ruled the northern kingdom of Velmore for 6 years, and in that time no one had dared touch his war drum without his word. It was sacred. It was struck only once, by his own hand, the night before his army marched. Yet here it was, marked by someone else, hours before the battle horns were set to sound. Who did this? His voice cut through the cold night air like a blade. The soldiers standing guard around the drum shifted uneasily. None answered. General Callum Brenner, his oldest friend and second in command, stepped forward with his jaw tight. No one saw anyone approach it, my king. The watch was set. No one crossed the line. Someone crossed it. Draven's eyes swept the camp, past the rows of tents, past the fires burning low, past the servants huddled near the supply wagons. Find them. It did not take long. A young soldier, barely past his first battle, admitted he had seen a shadow near the drum just before dawn. A girl. Thin. Quiet. He had assumed she was tending to the fires, as the servant girls often did, and thought nothing of it until the mark was discovered. Draven knew exactly who that was before the soldier even finished speaking. There was only one servant in the camp who moved like a shadow, who never spoke, who kept to herself in a way that made the other workers uneasy. Leora. She had come to the camp years ago, found half-starved on the road after her village was destroyed by raiders. Draven had allowed her to stay, more out of practicality than kindness, since the camp always needed hands to cook, clean, and carry water. She had never spoken a single word since the day she arrived. Some said she could not. Others whispered that she chose silence, that something in her past had taken her voice and locked it away. Draven had never paid her much attention. She was simply part of the camp's quiet machinery, the kind of person a king rarely notices until something forces him to. Now, standing before his marked drum, he found himself furious at a girl he barely knew. "Bring her to me," he said. The soldiers found Leora near the healer's tent, kneeling beside a wounded man, pressing a damp cloth to his forehead. She did not resist when they told her the king wanted to see her. She simply rose, wiped her hands on her apron, and followed without a sound. When she stood before Draven, her head bowed, her hands folded in front of her, he studied her for the first time in years. She was small, with dark hair pulled back in a simple braid, and eyes that held something heavy behind them, something that made even a king pause before speaking harshly. "Did you touch my drum?" he asked. She did not answer. Of course she did not. She could not. "Answer me," he said, though even as the words left his mouth, he knew they were pointless. Leora lifted her eyes to meet his, and for a moment, something passed between them. Not defiance, not fear, but a strange kind of steadiness that unsettled him more than any answer could have. She did not nod. She did not shake her head. She simply held his gaze, as though waiting for him to understand something on his own. "She cannot speak, my king," Callum reminded him quietly. "Perhaps we should bring someone who knows her signs." Draven had forgotten that some of the older servants had learned to communicate with Leora through simple hand gestures over the years. He had never bothered to learn it himself. Kings did not need to speak with servants in any language beyond command and obedience. "Fetch Margaret," he said. The old healer had cared for Leora since her arrival, and understood her signs better than anyone. While they waited, Draven studied Leora more closely. Her hands were rough from years of labor, but there was something deliberate in the way she stood, patient, unbothered by his anger, as though she had already decided that whatever consequence came, it was worth whatever she had done. Margaret arrived within minutes, her gray hair tucked beneath a worn shawl, her eyes tired but sharp. She glanced between the king and the girl, sensing the tension immediately. "My king," she said, bowing slightly. "How can I help?" "Ask her why she touched my war drum." Margaret turned to Leora and began moving her hands in slow, careful gestures. Leora watched closely, then responded with her own quick movements, her fingers tracing shapes in the air that Draven could not follow. Margaret's brow furrowed as she watched, and after a long pause, she turned back to the king. "She says it is a blessing, my king, for protection." "Protection from what?" Margaret relayed the question, and Leora's response came slower this time, her hands moving with more hesitation, as though the answer was harder to give than the first. "She says, from what happened to her before, she does not wish to explain further." Draven's frustration deepened. A servant girl was withholding answers from her king, hiding behind vague gestures and an old healer's incomplete translation. He was not a man accustomed to being denied information, especially not by someone with no voice to argue back. "Tell her this," he said, his tone hardening. "If she touches my drum again without my permission, she will be removed from this camp. Servants do not decide what happens to sacred things. Do you understand?" Margaret relayed the warning, and Leora's expression did not change, not out of defiance, but out of something closer to quiet acceptance. She nodded once, then bowed and turned to leave, following the soldiers back toward the healer's tent without another gesture exchanged. Draven watched her go, unsettled by how calm she remained even after his warning. Most people in the camp trembled when he raised his voice. She had simply listened, accepted his words, and walked away, as though the punishment mattered less to her than whatever reason drove her to mark the drum in the first place. That night, sleep did not come easily to him. He lay in his tent, staring at the canvas ceiling, replaying the strange calm in her eyes. There had been no fear there, only a kind of quiet certainty, the look of someone who had already lived through worse than a king's anger. The next morning, the camp buzzed with preparations for the coming battle against the raiders who had been terrorizing the eastern villages for months. Soldiers sharpened blades, checked armor, and loaded supply wagons, while Draven walked among them, offering words of encouragement and confidence, the kind a king was expected to give before sending men into danger. But his mind kept drifting back to the drum, and to the handprint that had been carefully wiped clean by the time the sun rose, though its faint shadow still lingered on the stretched skin if one looked closely enough. As the hour of departure approached, Draven found himself standing before the drum again, his hand resting on its surface, feeling the ghost of where her palm had pressed just hours before. He struck it once, as tradition demanded, and the deep sound rolled across the camp, signaling the army to prepare for the march. The battle that followed was fierce but short. The raiders, caught off guard by the speed of Velmor's forces, retreated after heavy losses, and Draven's army returned to camp by nightfall, with only minor injuries among their ranks. It was, by every measure, a clean victory. He told himself it meant nothing, that battles were won through strategy and strength, not superstition. Yet as he sat by the fire that evening, watching Callum organize the wounded for treatment, he found his eyes drifting toward the healer's tent, where Leora moved quietly between injured soldiers, tending wounds with the same careful hands that had marked his drum. She did not look toward him. She never did. But something about her presence in the camp felt different now, no longer invisible, no longer simply part of the background. He had noticed her, and once a king notices something, it becomes difficult to look away. 3 days later, before the next battle was called, Draven ordered extra guards placed around the drum through the night. He wanted to see for himself whether she would attempt her strange ritual again, despite his warning. Whether curiosity or suspicion drove him more, even he could not say for certain. What he did not expect was how much he would come to regret ignoring the answer that was already forming in front of him, an answer far more complicated than simple disobedience, one that would take him far longer to understand than he ever imagined that first night beside the marked drum. The guards took their positions just after midnight, spread in a wide circle around the platform where the war drum stood. Draven remained in the shadows near his own tent, wrapped in a dark cloak, watching. He told himself this was simply prudent leadership, a king ensuring order in his own camp. He did not examine too closely why he had chosen to watch personally rather than simply trust his soldiers' reports. Hours passed. The fires burned low. Most of the camp slept, except for the rotating watch and the occasional soldier returning from patrol. Draven's eyes grew heavy, but he forced himself to stay alert, unwilling to miss whatever might happen. Just before the first hint of dawn touched the sky, he saw her. Leora moved through the camp with practiced silence, staying low, keeping to the shadows between tents exactly as she must have done every time before. She did not rush. She did not look nervous. She moved with the calm certainty of someone performing a task she had done many times, someone who believed fully in its importance despite the risk. Draven watched as she approached the guard circle, and for a moment, he expected the soldiers to stop her immediately. But she paused at the edge of the torchlight, waiting, watching the guards' movements with careful patience, timing her approach for the brief moment when their attention shifted toward the tree line, at the sound of some distant animal. In that heartbeat of distraction, she slipped forward, pressed her palm against the drum's surface, and withdrew just as quickly, disappearing back into the shadows before the guards even turned back around. Draven remained frozen for a long moment, torn between calling out and simply watching to see where she went. In the end, curiosity won over anger. He followed at a distance, careful to stay unseen, as she made her way to the edge of the camp, past the supply tents, toward a small clearing shielded by low bushes and a cluster of young trees. There, in the pale light of early morning, he saw something that made him stop entirely. A small shrine, built from stacked stones, stood in the clearing, decorated with wilted flowers, small carved wooden figures, and strips of faded cloth tied to the branches above. Leora knelt before it, her head bowed, her lips moving in silent words that made no sound, but clearly carried meaning only she understood. Draven had seen many shrines in his years as king, built for gods, for ancestors, for fallen soldiers. But something about the way Leora knelt before this one, alone in the dim light, unaware she was being watched, struck him differently than any temple ceremony he had witnessed before. He did not approach, he did not announce his presence. He simply watched from a distance as she remained there for several long minutes, her shoulders trembling slightly, though whether from cold or something deeper he could not tell. When she finally rose and made her way back toward the camp, Draven remained hidden until she passed, his mind turning over everything he had just witnessed. The handprint was not simple defiance. It was not superstition without meaning. It was tied to whatever grief lived behind that small shrine, whatever loss had carved silence into a girl who might have once had a voice like anyone else. He returned to his tent as the camp began to stir with the sounds of mourning. But sleep was impossible now. Questions multiplied in his mind faster than he could organize them. Who was Leora before the raiders destroyed her village? What had she lost that required a shrine hidden in the trees? And why did marking his war drum matter so much to her that she risked punishment, even banishment, to continue doing it? He knew, with a certainty that unsettled him, that he could not simply dismiss this any longer. Whatever answers existed, he would need to seek them out properly, not through anger or threats, but through patience he was not accustomed to offering anyone, least of all a servant with no voice to explain herself. For the first time since becoming king, Draven Ashcombe found himself facing a mystery that armies and strategy could not solve, one that would require him to set aside his crown for a moment and simply listen, in whatever way a mute girl could teach him how. Word spread quickly through the camp that the king himself had been seen near the healer's tent more often than usual. Soldiers noticed it first, the way idle men always notice small shifts in routine, and soon whispers followed Draven wherever he walked. He ignored them, telling himself a king could visit any part of his own camp without explanation owed to anyone. The truth was simpler and harder to admit. He wanted to understand Leora, and understanding required proximity, patient observation, something entirely foreign to a man used to giving orders rather than asking questions he could not force answers to. Margaret noticed his presence too, though she said nothing directly. She simply continued her work, tending wounds, mixing remedies, occasionally glancing toward the king with the quiet knowing look of someone who had lived long enough to recognize curiosity when she saw it. One afternoon, as Leora changed the bandages on a young soldier's arm, Draven approached the tent under the excuse of checking on the wounded man's recovery. He watched her hands move with practiced gentleness, wrapping the cloth with a care that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than simple duty. "How long has she tended the wounded?" he asked Margaret quietly, careful to keep his voice low enough that Leora, focused on her task, would not notice the question was about her. "Since she was old enough to hold a cloth steady," Margaret answered. "She has a gift for it, my king, steadier hands than most healers twice her age." "And her past? Before she came here?" Margaret's expression grew careful, the way it did whenever a subject touched on grief too deep to discuss lightly. "That is not mine to share, my king. If you wish to know, you would need to ask her yourself, in whatever way she can answer." Draven considered this for a long moment, watching Leora finish her work and move to the next patient without a single wasted motion. He realized, with some discomfort, that he had spent years ruling a kingdom, commanding armies, and negotiating with rival lords, yet he did not know the simplest way to have a conversation with someone who could not speak. That evening, he asked Margaret to teach him. She seemed surprised by the request, though she did not question it aloud. Instead, she began with the basics, simple gestures for greetings, for yes and no, for common words used daily in the camp. Draven, unused to feeling clumsy at anything, found himself frustrated by how slowly his hands learned what came naturally to Leora. "You are trying too hard to command it," Margaret told him with a faint smile. "It is not an order given to soldiers. It is a language, like any other. It takes patience." Patience was not a virtue Draven had cultivated in his years as king, but he pushed through the discomfort, practicing gestures alone in his tent at night, determined to eventually speak with Leora in a way that did not require an intermediary standing between them. Meanwhile, preparations continued for the next confrontation with the raiders, who had regrouped along the eastern border after their previous defeat. Scouts reported their numbers had grown, reinforced by mercenaries hired from beyond the mountains, and Callum warned that this battle would not be as easily won as the last. The night before the army was set to march, Draven made a decision that surprised even himself. Rather than posting guards to prevent Leora from approaching the drum, he ordered them removed entirely, leaving the platform unguarded through the night. Callum questioned the order immediately. "My king, if anyone else learns of this ritual, they may see it as a sign of instability, a symbol that even you cannot control your own camp. Let them see what they wish," Draven replied. "I want to know if she still comes, without guards forcing her into secrecy." That night he watched from his tent once more, though this time without the pretense of preventing anything. As the moon rose high above the camp, Leora emerged from the shadows near the servants' quarters and made her way toward the drum, moving with the same quiet confidence as before, though perhaps slightly less cautious now that no guard stood between her and her purpose. She pressed her palm against the drum's surface, held it there a moment longer than usual, then withdrew and turned to leave. But this time, as she turned, she found Draven standing several paces away, watching openly rather than hidden in shadow. She froze, her eyes widening slightly, though she did not run. Draven raised his hands slowly and formed the simple gesture Margaret had taught him, the sign for peace, non-threatening, meant to reassure rather than command. Leora studied him carefully, clearly surprised that her king had bothered to learn even this much. After a long moment, she offered a small nod, acknowledging his effort without fully trusting it. Draven took a careful step closer, then formed another gesture, clumsy and slow, asking why. It was not perfect, his hands still unfamiliar with the movements, but Leora seemed to understand his intention regardless. She hesitated, glancing back toward the drum, then toward the distant clearing where her shrine remained hidden among the trees. For a long moment she said nothing, her hands still at her sides, as though deciding whether a king truly deserved an answer to a question he had once demanded through threats rather than understanding. Finally, she lifted her hands and began to sign, slowly, allowing him to follow even with his limited knowledge. He caught only fragments: protection, family, gone, but enough to understand that whatever she was trying to tell him carried weight far beyond a simple servant's superstition. "I want to understand," he signed back, the gesture awkward but sincere. "Please." Leora studied him for a long moment, as though weighing whether his words held any real meaning, or were simply another command dressed in gentler language. Something in his expression must have convinced her, because she finally gestured toward the clearing, inviting him to follow, an invitation she had never extended to anyone in the camp before. They walked together in silence, the kind of silence that felt different from the tension of their earlier encounters, quieter, more careful, as though both understood they stood at the edge of something neither could fully predict. When they reached the shrine, Leora knelt beside it as she always did, but this time she gestured for Draven to sit as well, an invitation he accepted despite the strangeness of a king kneeling in the dirt beside a servant's private altar. She began to sign slowly, pointing to the small wooden figures arranged among the stones, each one representing someone, a mother, a father, siblings whose names Draven did not yet know how to ask for properly. Her hands moved with a mixture of grief and determination, the story unfolding piece by piece in gestures rather than words, yet somehow more powerful for the effort each movement required. He understood, even without full command of her language, that these figures represented her family, and that whatever tragedy claimed her voice had also claimed everyone she once loved. The pieces of understanding settled into him slowly, heavier with each gesture, until he began to grasp why marking a war drum before battle meant something far deeper than mere ritual. It was protection offered the only way she knew how, a desperate attempt to prevent other families from suffering what hers had endured, carried forward through silent hands because her voice had been taken long before she ever found her way to his camp. Draven sat in the dim light of early morning, watching Leora's hands fall still after finishing her story, and felt something shift inside him that he did not yet have words to describe either. The following weeks brought changes to the camp that few noticed at first, small shifts in routine that seemed insignificant on their own but together painted a picture of something new taking root. Draven no longer summoned Margaret each time he wished to communicate with Leora. Instead, he practiced his signs daily, improving slowly, though still far from fluent, enough that simple exchanges became possible between them. He learned her full story in fragments, pieced together over quiet mornings near the healer's tent, or evenings beside her hidden shrine. Her village had stood along the eastern border, a peaceful farming community that had never expected the raiders who descended upon it one autumn night years ago. Her parents had hidden her in a grain cellar as the attack began, telling her to stay silent no matter what she heard above. She had remained hidden for hours, listening to sounds she refused to fully describe even now, until the silence outside finally convinced her it was safe to emerge. By then, there was nothing left to return to. Her voice, Margaret later explained to Draven privately, had simply stopped working sometime during those hours in the cellar. Whether from the shock of what she witnessed or the trauma of forced silence itself, no healer had ever been able to say for certain. She had wandered for days afterward, alone, until soldiers from Draven's border patrol found her and brought her to the nearest camp, uncertain what else to do with a child who could not explain who she was or where she had come from. She had been given work suited to her age as she grew, cooking, cleaning, eventually assisting with the wounded once her steady hands proved useful in the healer's tent. The handprint ritual, she explained through careful signs one evening, had come from her mother, a tradition passed through generations of women in her family, meant to offer protection to those who marched into danger. It was, in a sense, the only piece of her mother she still carried forward, a fragment of ritual surviving where memory of a voice no longer could. Draven found himself carrying this knowledge differently than he expected. Where once he might have dismissed such traditions as simple superstition unworthy of a king's attention, he now understood the weight behind each gesture, each quiet act of devotion performed not for recognition, but out of genuine belief that it might spare someone else the fate her family had suffered. Callum noticed the change in his king before anyone else dared mention it. "You spend considerable time near the healer's tent these days," he observed one evening, careful to keep his tone neutral rather than accusatory. "She has taught me something about this camp I should have understood long ago," Draven replied, unwilling to explain further, though Callum's raised eyebrow suggested he understood more than his king intended to reveal. The next confrontation with the raiders came sooner than expected. Scouts reported movement along the eastern border, larger forces than before, suggesting the mercenaries reinforcing their numbers had finally arrived in full strength. Callum urged caution, suggesting they wait for additional support from allied territories before engaging. But Draven, aware of villages still vulnerable along that border, decided the risk of waiting outweighed the benefit. The night before departure, Leora came to the drum as she always did, though this time Draven stood beside her rather than watching from a distance. She glanced at him with mild surprise, uncertain what his presence meant, until he gestured for her to continue, an acknowledgement rather than an interruption. She pressed her palm against the drum, and for the first time, Draven found himself pressing his own hand beside hers, not overlapping, simply present, a silent partnership formed between two people who had begun this journey as strangers, separated by rank and misunderstanding. The battle that followed proved far more difficult than previous engagements. The raiders had indeed grown stronger, their numbers swelled by mercenaries skilled in tactics Velmore's forces had not encountered before. Draven found himself in the thick of the confrontation longer than usual, his strategies tested against opponents who refused to retreat as easily as before. Hours into the engagement, as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, a moment of chaos separated Draven from his personal guard. Surrounded briefly by enemy forces, he fought his way through with the skill that had earned him his reputation, though not without sustaining injuries that would require attention once the battle concluded. By the time Velmore's forces secured victory, driving the raiders back beyond the border with heavier losses than either side had anticipated, Draven returned to camp bearing wounds along his arm and shoulder, painful but not life-threatening. The kind soldiers endured regularly without much complaint. Leora was among the first to reach him when the wounded were brought into camp, her hands immediately assessing the injuries with the practiced efficiency Margaret had trained into her over years of service. She worked quickly, cleaning and binding his wounds with a focus that allowed no room for the formality typically expected between servant and king. Draven watched her work in silence, noting the slight tremor in her hands that betrayed concern she otherwise kept carefully hidden behind professional calm. When she finished, she looked up at him, her eyes searching his face for confirmation that the pain was manageable. A question asked without words yet perfectly understood. "I am well," he signed, the gesture still clumsy but clear enough for her to understand. She studied him a moment longer, then nodded, though something in her expression suggested she had been more frightened during the battle's uncertain hours than she was willing to fully show. It struck him, watching her carefully controlled relief, that her concern extended beyond simple duty, that whatever bond had formed between them over recent weeks carried weight for her as much as it did for him. That night, as the camp settled into uneasy rest following the day's difficult victory, Draven found Leora once more near her hidden shrine, kneeling before the stacked stones in quiet reflection. He approached slowly, mindful not to intrude uninvited, though she glanced up and gestured for him to join her without hesitation this time. They sat together in silence for a long while, watching the small flames of candles she had lit flicker against the darkness. Finally, Draven formed a question he had been considering for days, one that required more nuance than his limited signing could easily convey. "Why continue this ritual," he asked, "when so many still doubt its purpose?" Leora considered the question carefully before responding, her hands moving with deliberate slowness to ensure his understanding. She explained, through gestures built from patience and repetition, that belief did not require others to share it, that comfort could exist even when unproven, and that honoring her mother's memory mattered more to her than convincing skeptics of its power. Draven found himself struck by the simplicity and strength of her reasoning, a perspective he had never considered from someone he once dismissed as merely superstitious. Kings were expected to deal in certainties, strategies proven through experience and calculation. Yet here was a girl who had lost everything, finding meaning in something intangible, something that asked for nothing beyond quiet devotion and hope. "Perhaps," he signed slowly, "your ritual has done more for this camp than we realized." Leora's expression softened at this, the closest thing to a smile he had seen cross her face since he began truly noticing her presence in his camp. It was not agreement exactly, but something gentler, an acknowledgement that perhaps understanding between them had finally begun to take root where suspicion once stood. News of the king's growing closeness with a mute servant girl inevitably spread beyond the boundaries of casual observation, into something closer to concern among certain members of his court. Advisors who had traveled with the army for administrative purposes began murmuring among themselves, questioning whether a king should devote such personal attention to someone so far beneath his station. Edwin Marsh, the eldest of Draven's advisors and a man who had served the crown since before Draven's own birth, approached the subject directly one evening as the king reviewed reports from scattered border patrols. "My king, forgive my bluntness, but there are those within the court who question the wisdom of your attention toward the servant girl. Some suggest it distracts from matters of greater importance." Draven did not look up immediately from his reports, though his jaw tightened slightly at the implication. "And what matters would those be, Edwin?" "Succession, my king. Alliances. The kingdom requires stability, and stability often depends on perceptions maintained carefully among nobility and common folk alike. A king's personal interests, however genuine, can create complications if not managed with discretion." "Are you suggesting I hide my actions from my own court?" Edwin hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "I am suggesting caution, my king. Nothing more." Draven set aside his reports and studied his advisor with the patience he had learned, ironically, from watching Leora navigate a world that too often dismissed her without proper consideration. "Tell me, Edwin, has this girl ever asked anything of me? Has she sought favor, position, or advantage from whatever attention I have shown her?" "No, my king. By all accounts, she remains as devoted to her duties as ever, seeking nothing beyond her usual work." "Then, perhaps the concern lies not with her actions, but with how others perceive mine. That is a matter I am willing to address directly, should it become necessary." Edwin bowed slightly, recognizing the conversation had reached its natural conclusion, though the concern in his eyes suggested the matter was far from settled among the wider court. Word of these murmurs eventually reached Leora as well, carried through the careful attentiveness of camp gossip that traveled quickly regardless of rank. Margaret mentioned it gently one afternoon while the two worked together preparing remedies for the healer's stores, careful not to alarm the girl unnecessarily, yet believing she deserved to understand the situation developing around her. Leora's response, communicated through slow, thoughtful signs, revealed no surprise at the news, only quiet acceptance of consequences she had perhaps anticipated from the moment the king first began learning her language. She explained to Margaret that she never sought his attention, that she would gladly retreat back into anonymity if it meant avoiding difficulty for him, though something in her expression suggested this resignation cost her more than she was willing to fully admit. When Draven learned of this conversation through Margaret's careful retelling, he found himself troubled by the thought of Leora believing she should disappear back into obscurity to protect him from court gossip. It struck him as deeply unfair that someone who had endured so much loss should now consider sacrificing whatever small connection she had found simply because others judged it improper. He sought her out that evening, finding her near the supply wagons organizing bandages and remedies for the following day's needs. She glanced up as he approached, her expression carefully neutral, though he had learned enough of her subtle cues to recognize the guarded distance she had placed between them since learning of the court's disapproval. "You heard the whispers," he signed, direct rather than dancing around the subject. She nodded, her hands remaining still at her sides rather than responding immediately. They mean nothing, he continued, his signs growing more confident with practice. I decide what matters to this kingdom, not idle gossip among nervous advisors. Leora studied him for a long moment before finally responding, her signs measured and deliberate. She explained that she understood the burden a king carried, that perception mattered for maintaining order and confidence among both nobility and common folk, and that she would never wish to become a source of instability for someone responsible for so many lives. You are not instability, Draven signed firmly. You have marked that drum before every battle we have fought, and every time, we have returned with fewer losses than expected. If anything, you have brought this camp more stability than any advisor's caution ever could. This seemed to catch her off guard, her eyes widening slightly at the directness of his statement. She had never considered, it seemed, that her quiet ritual might carry weight beyond personal comfort, that others might view her contribution as something valuable rather than simply tolerated. Over the following weeks, Draven made a point of publicly acknowledging Leora's presence in ways he had previously avoided, not through grand gestures that might draw unwanted attention, but through small, consistent actions that gradually shifted how the camp perceived her. He ensured she received proper credit for her healing work during battlefield reports. He defended her when younger soldiers occasionally mocked her inability to speak. He made certain Margaret understood she had his full support in training Leora further in the healing arts, should she wish to expand her responsibilities within the camp. These changes did not eliminate all doubt among the court, but they gradually shifted the narrative from suspicion toward grudging respect, particularly as soldiers who had witnessed Leora's steady hands during difficult recoveries began speaking favorably of her skill, rather than focusing solely on her silence. Callum, ever practical, eventually approached Draven with a different kind of counsel than Edwin had offered. The soldiers respect competence, my king, regardless of rank or voice. If she continues proving her value as she has, the court's concerns will fade with time, provided you continue handling the matter with the same patience you have shown thus far. Draven appreciated this perspective more than Edwin's caution, recognizing in Callum's words a truth he had come to understand through his own growing relationship with Leora. Respect earned through consistent action carried more weight than any position granted through birth or decree, a lesson that applied as much to a mute servant girl as it did to any soldier or noble within his kingdom. As autumn deepened and preparations began for what scouts warned might be the raiders' largest coordinated assault yet, Draven found himself relying on Leora's presence not simply for the ritual she performed before each battle, but for the quiet stability she brought to moments when the weight of leadership threatened to overwhelm him entirely. He had not expected, when he first discovered that unexplained handprint upon his sacred drum, that it would lead him toward understanding a language built from silence, a history shaped by unimaginable loss, and a connection that challenged everything he once believed about the boundaries separating a king from those he ruled over. Whatever the coming battle demanded of him, he found comfort in knowing Leora would be there beside the drum once more, her palm pressed against its worn surface, carrying forward a tradition born from grief but sustained through hope, a hope he now shared rather than merely tolerated. Not everyone within the camp accepted the shifting perception of Leora with the same grace as Callum or the common soldiers who had witnessed her healing skill firsthand. Among the nobles who occasionally visited camp to monitor the kingdom's military affairs was Lord Harwick Vale, a man whose ambitions had long included securing influence over Draven through more traditional means, namely through arranging a marriage between the king and his own daughter. Harwick's frustration grew as rumors of the king's attention toward a servant girl continued circulating, threatening plans he had carefully cultivated for years. He arrived at camp under the pretense of discussing supply logistics, though his true purpose became clear soon after his arrival. My king, he began during a private audience, his tone carefully respectful despite the challenge underlying his words. Concerns have reached my ears regarding certain practices within your camp, rituals performed by servants upon sacred instruments of war. Some among the nobility question whether such practices reflect properly upon the crown's judgment. Draven recognized immediately the source of these concerns, though he maintained careful composure rather than revealing the irritation building within him. The practices you refer to have brought no harm to this kingdom, Lord Harwick. Quite the opposite. Our recent campaigns have shown improved outcomes since their continuation. Improved outcomes attributed to superstition rather than strategy invite questions about leadership stability, my king. Forgive my directness, but a girl who cannot even speak, influencing matters as significant as military morale, raises concerns among those who value more traditional governance. Draven felt his patience thinning, though he chose his response carefully. aware that direct confrontation with Harwick's political influence required more nuance than simple dismissal. Leora's inability to speak does not diminish her value to this camp, Lord Harwick. If anything, it has taught me more about genuine devotion than most conversations I have had with those who possess full command of language, yet offer far less substance. Harwick's expression tightened slightly at this rebuke, though he maintained his composure. I mean no disrespect toward the girl herself, my king. My concern lies solely with perception among those whose support your kingdom requires for continued stability. Then perhaps, Draven replied evenly, those concerned with perception should spend less time worrying about a servant's private rituals and more time considering the actual results our campaigns have achieved under her continued involvement. The conversation ended without resolution, though Harwick's departure from camp carried an undertone of simmering frustration rather than genuine acceptance. Draven understood this exchange represented merely one battle within a larger conflict brewing beneath the surface of court politics, one that would likely require more than a single conversation to fully resolve. He mentioned nothing of this exchange to Leora directly, though her perceptive nature meant she likely sensed the tension surrounding recent noble visits regardless of what remained unspoken between them. She continued her duties with the same quiet consistency as always, tending wounds, preparing remedies, and marking the drum before each battle without hesitation despite whatever whispered concerns circulated among those who questioned her presence. As the coordinated assault scouts had warned of finally materialized along the eastern border, larger and more organized than any previous confrontation with the raiders, Draven found himself facing the most significant military challenge of his reign thus far. Reports suggested the mercenary forces reinforcing the raiders had grown substantial enough to threaten not just border villages, but potentially the security of Velmore's capital itself should this battle end poorly. The night before departure, tension hung heavy over the entire camp, soldiers checking and rechecking equipment with the nervous energy that preceded battles everyone understood carried higher stakes than usual. Draven moved among his troops, offering the confidence and reassurance expected of a king preparing his forces for what might become the defining confrontation of his rule. When he finally made his way toward the drum in the late hours before dawn, he found Leora already waiting, her expression carrying a gravity he had not seen in previous rituals, as though she too understood the weight this particular battle carried beyond simple routine. She pressed her palm against the drum's surface as always, holding it there longer than usual, her eyes closed in what appeared to be silent prayer beyond her typical quiet ritual. When she finally withdrew her hand, she turned to Draven and signed something he had not seen her communicate before, slow and deliberate, ensuring he understood every word, despite his still developing command of her language. "This battle will test you beyond others," she signed. "Return to me." The simplicity and directness of her message struck him deeply, carrying weight beyond mere formality, a genuine plea born from whatever bond had grown between them over recent months. He signed back with equal sincerity, "I will." Whether it was promise or hope, neither of them could fully guarantee. The exchange settled something within him as he prepared to lead his forces into what scouts warned would be their most difficult confrontation yet. The army departed before dawn, marching toward the eastern border where the combined raider and mercenary forces had gathered in numbers that made even Callum's usually steady confidence waver slightly during final strategy discussions. Draven rode at the front of his forces, his mind carrying Leora's final message alongside the strategic considerations required for the battle ahead. As they approached the border and the first signs of enemy positions came into view, Draven understood immediately that this confrontation would indeed test every aspect of his leadership, strategy, and personal courage, in ways previous battles had not fully prepared him for. The scale of forces arrayed against them suggested a battle that would determine not just border security, but potentially the broader stability of his entire kingdom moving forward. Whatever outcome awaited them in the hours ahead, Draven carried forward not just his soldiers' trust and his advisors' strategic counsel, but something new as well. A quiet strength drawn from understanding forged through patience, from a bond built between a king and a girl whose silence had taught him more about genuine devotion than any court conversation ever had. The eastern plain stretched wide beneath a gray morning sky, and across its expanse, the combined forces of raiders and mercenaries had arranged themselves in formations that spoke of coordinated leadership rather than the disorganized raids Velmore had faced in previous seasons. Callum surveyed the enemy lines through narrowed eyes, calculating numbers that exceeded even the scouts' most cautious estimates. "They have brought everything," Callum murmured, riding beside Draven as the army came to a halt at the edge of the plain. "This is not a border skirmish, my king. This is an attempt to break Velmore's eastern defenses entirely." Draven studied the formations spread before them, recognizing the same conclusion Callum had reached. Whatever leadership had organized this assault understood strategy well enough to threaten not just the border, but the broader stability of the kingdom should this battle end in defeat. "Then we will not allow that outcome," Draven replied, his voice carrying the steady confidence his soldiers needed to hear, regardless of whatever uncertainty lingered beneath his composed exterior. The battle began with careful positioning rather than immediate confrontation, both sides testing the other's formations, searching for weaknesses that might be exploited without unnecessary risk. Draven directed his forces with the strategic precision honed through years of experience, adjusting positions as the enemy's movements revealed patterns worth countering. Hours passed in careful maneuvering, small confrontations along the flanks testing resolve without committing to the full engagement both sides understood was inevitable. Draven remained near the center of his forces, coordinating movements through messengers and signals, his focus entirely consumed by the shifting dynamics of the field before him. As afternoon approached, the enemy finally committed to a coordinated push along Velmore's left flank, forcing Callum's division into a difficult defensive position that threatened to fracture the broader formation if not addressed quickly. Draven recognized the danger immediately, understanding that a break along the flank could expose his entire force to encirclement. He made the decision to personally lead reinforcements toward the threatened position, a choice that placed him closer to the heart of the confrontation than his advisors would have preferred, though the urgency of the situation left little room for more cautious alternatives. The reinforcement effort succeeded in stabilizing Callum's position, but the fighting along that flank grew intense enough that Draven found himself more directly involved in the confrontation than any battle since his early years as a young commander. The enemy forces, sensing an opportunity to break through before Velmore's reinforcements could fully secure their position, pressed their advantage with renewed intensity. In the chaos of that engagement, Draven sustained a significant injury, a deep wound along his side that immediately compromised his ability to continue directing the battle from his previous position. Recognizing the danger, his personal guard moved quickly to extract him from the immediate confrontation, though the process itself proved difficult given the intensity of fighting still surrounding their position. By the time Draven was brought clear of the direct engagement, his condition had grown serious enough that the soldiers accompanying him understood the situation required urgent attention beyond what battlefield treatment could adequately provide. Word was sent immediately toward the rear positions where healers, including Leora, had established treatment areas for the wounded. The battle itself continued without Draven's direct leadership, Callum assuming full command as reports of the king's injury spread cautiously among trusted officers, careful to prevent panic from destabilizing the broader formation during such a critical moment. Through disciplined execution of the strategies already established, Velmore's forces gradually gained the advantage, eventually forcing the combined raider and mercenary forces into retreat as evening approached. While the battle concluded with Velmore's forces claiming victory, the cost proved significant, with casualties exceeding previous engagements and the king himself among the seriously wounded requiring immediate and sustained treatment. As soldiers carried Draven toward the treatment area established at the camp's rear positions, word spread quickly that their king's condition remained uncertain. Leora was already working among the wounded when Draven arrived, her hands moving swiftly between soldiers requiring immediate attention, her focus entirely consumed by the demands of treating injuries far more severe than the camp typically encountered. When she recognized the king being carried toward her treatment area, something shifted in her expression. A controlled panic quickly suppressed beneath professional urgency. She moved immediately to assess his condition, her hands working with practiced efficiency despite whatever fear lingered beneath her composed exterior. Margaret joined her quickly, the two working together to stabilize the wound and address the significant blood loss that had left Draven barely conscious by the time proper treatment began. The hours that followed tested every skill Leora had developed over years of tending the wounded, her steady hands working through the night, as she and Margaret fought to stabilize a condition that remained precarious, despite their combined efforts. Draven drifted in and out of awareness during this period, occasionally catching glimpses of Leora's focused expression as she worked to keep him alive through whatever means her training and instinct provided. At one particularly critical moment, as fever began to take hold and complications threatened to undo whatever progress had been made, Leora made a decision born from desperation rather than established practice. She had learned, through years of quiet observation and experimentation beyond what Margaret formally taught her, certain remedies passed down through her own family's forgotten traditions, methods she had never dared use openly given their unproven nature within the camp's more conventional healing practices. With Margaret's exhausted permission, granted through the trust built over years of working alongside the younger healer, Leora prepared a remedy drawn from these half-remembered family traditions, a combination of herbs and careful treatment methods that represented her last available option, should conventional treatment fail to stabilize the king's worsening condition. Through the deepest hours of that night, as the camp held its collective breath awaiting word of their king's fate, Leora remained at his side, her hands working continuously to manage his fever, her silent determination carrying a weight that Margaret later described as more powerful than any medicine alone could have provided. By the time dawn began breaking over the camp, Draven's fever finally broke, his condition stabilizing enough that Margaret allowed herself the first genuine relief since his arrival hours before. Leora remained beside him even then, her exhaustion evident but her vigilance unwavering, unwilling to leave his side until she felt fully confident the immediate danger had passed. Recovery proved slow, the injury requiring weeks of careful rest despite Draven's natural impatience with anything that kept him from his usual responsibilities. Callum assumed temporary command of ongoing military matters, ensuring the kingdom's affairs continued smoothly while their king regained his strength, though he made a point of visiting daily, keeping Draven informed of developments even as healers insisted on limiting his direct involvement. Throughout this period, Leora remained a constant presence, her role shifting naturally from emergency treatment toward the steady, patient care required for proper healing. She changed his bandages, monitored his progress, and ensured he followed the rest prescribed by Margaret's careful instructions, often with a firmness that surprised him, given her typically quiet demeanor. Their conversations, conducted increasingly through signs that had grown more fluent between them over recent months, deepened during these weeks of forced proximity. Draven learned more of the small details that made up her daily existence, her preferences, her private thoughts on camp life, fragments of personality that emerged more freely now that trust had firmly replaced the suspicion that once defined their earliest interactions. He learned, too, of the remedy she had used during his most critical hours, the family tradition she had risked using despite uncertainty about how it might be received within the camp's more established healing practices. When he asked why she had taken such a risk, her response, communicated through careful signs, carried a simplicity that struck him deeply. "I could not lose you," she signed, without knowing I had tried everything within my ability to prevent it. The directness of this admission settled something between them that had perhaps been building since that first night he discovered her handprint upon his war drum. Whatever careful distance had once existed between king and servant had gradually dissolved into something neither fully anticipated when their strange journey together first began. News of Leora's role in saving the king's life spread quickly through the camp and eventually reached the broader court, shifting perception in ways that even Lord Harwick's continued objections could not fully counter. Soldiers who had witnessed her tireless work throughout that difficult night spoke openly of her dedication, while Margaret's account of the remedy that ultimately stabilized the king's condition added weight to arguments that her value to the kingdom extended far beyond simple servant duties. Edwin, who had once counseled caution regarding the king's attention toward Leora, found himself reconsidering his position given these developments. When he next addressed the matter with Draven, his tone carried considerably less reservation than before. "The girl saved your life, my king. Whatever concerns existed regarding perception seemed considerably diminished given such undeniable proof of her value and devotion." Draven, still recovering but growing stronger daily, found himself relieved that circumstances had shifted the court's perspective, though he recognized the cost of that shift had been far higher than he would have wished. Nevertheless, he understood this represented an opportunity to address more permanently the questions surrounding Leora's place within his life and his kingdom. As his strength gradually returned and he resumed more active involvement in governing Velmore's affairs, Draven began considering how best to formally acknowledge the bond that had developed between them, aware that whatever decision he made would carry significant implications for both his personal life and his broader responsibilities as king. He discussed the matter privately with Callum first, trusting his oldest friend's judgment on how such a decision might be received among both the military ranks and the wider nobility. Callum, who had witnessed the entire journey from suspicious confrontation to genuine partnership, offered his support without hesitation. "You have found something rare, my king, a connection built through genuine understanding rather than political convenience. Whatever challenges arise from formalizing this bond, I believe the kingdom will ultimately recognize its value, particularly given everything Leora has already demonstrated through her actions." With this encouragement, Draven began planning how best to approach Leora with intentions that extended beyond their current arrangement, aware that such a significant step required careful consideration of her own wishes, rather than simply his own decision as king. He understood, perhaps more deeply now than ever before, that genuine partnership required mutual choice rather than unilateral decree, regardless of the authority his position typically afforded him. The weeks that followed his recovery brought a quiet transformation to camp life, as Draven's renewed strength allowed him to resume full command, while maintaining the deepened connection with Leora that recent events had solidified beyond casual observation. Their daily interactions, once conducted primarily through Margaret's translation, now flowed with increasing ease, as both continued refining the shared language that had become central to their growing bond. One evening, as autumn gave way to the first cold signs of approaching winter, Draven found Leora at her hidden shrine once more, tending the small collection of stones and wooden figures with the same quiet devotion she had shown since he first discovered this private sanctuary months before. He approached slowly, as he always did, mindful of the sacred space this represented for her. She glanced up as he settled beside her, offering a small smile that had grown more frequent in recent weeks, a warmth replacing the guarded caution that once defined her expression whenever he drew near. "I have been thinking," he signed carefully, wanting to ensure his meaning came through clearly despite the significance of what he intended to convey, "about how much you have given this kingdom, and how much you have given me personally, without ever asking for anything in return." Leora watched him with quiet attention, her hands remaining still as she waited to understand where this conversation might lead. "I would like to offer something in return," he continued, "not out of obligation, but out of genuine desire to build a life alongside you, as partners, rather than as king and servant." The weight of this statement settled between them, and for a long moment, Leora simply studied his face, searching for confirmation that his words carried the sincerity she needed, before allowing herself to fully believe such a possibility could exist, for someone who had spent so many years believing herself unworthy of anything beyond quiet service. Finally, she reached toward the small wooden figures representing her family, touching them gently before turning back to Draven, with eyes that shimmered with emotion she rarely allowed herself to show openly. She signed slowly, her hands trembling slightly with the significance of her response. "I would be honored," she signed, "to build that life with you." News of the king's intention to formally recognize Leora as his chosen partner spread through Velmore with the speed such significant announcements typically carried, generating reactions ranging from genuine celebration among common folk who had come to admire her quiet strength, to lingering skepticism among certain nobles who still struggled to accept a servant girl's elevation to such a significant position within the kingdom. Lord Harwick, predictably, raised objections through official channels, arguing that tradition demanded partnerships befitting a king's station be drawn from established noble families, rather than servants whose origins remained largely unknown, beyond the tragedy that brought her into Velmore's care. Draven addressed these objections directly during a formal council session, aware that resolving such concerns properly required transparency, rather than simply overriding dissent through royal authority alone. "Lord Harwick speaks of tradition," Draven began, addressing the assembled council with the confidence that had guided him through many difficult confrontations. "Yet tradition alone has never determined what makes a partnership worthy, or a person deserving of respect. Leora has demonstrated devotion, skill, and courage that few among this court have matched, saving my life through knowledge and determination that owes nothing to noble birth." He continued, recounting for the council the full journey that had led to this moment, from the mysterious handprint that first drew his attention, through the gradual understanding built between them, to the desperate night when her unconventional remedy had ultimately saved him when more established treatments proved insufficient. The council listened, some with genuine interest, others with reluctant acknowledgement that the facts presented left little room for continued objection based purely on origin or station. By the session's conclusion, even Harwick found himself unable to sustain meaningful opposition against evidence so clearly demonstrating Leora's value and character, though his support remained notably reserved compared to the genuine enthusiasm shown by other council members who had witnessed her contributions firsthand throughout recent months. The formal ceremony recognizing their partnership took place as winter's first snow began settling over Velmore's capital, a modest affair by royal standards, reflecting both Draven's understanding of Leora's preference for simplicity and the genuine sincerity underlying their bond rather than political spectacle. Soldiers who had served alongside them through recent battles gathered alongside common folk from villages Leora's silent rituals had helped protect, creating an atmosphere of genuine celebration rather than mere formal obligation. Margaret stood proudly among the witnesses, having watched Leora grow from a frightened, silent child into a woman whose quiet strength had ultimately captured a king's genuine devotion. Callum, ever practical, offered his blessing with characteristic directness, acknowledging that few partnerships he had witnessed carried such clear foundation in mutual respect and demonstrated loyalty. As part of the ceremony, Draven made a decision that surprised many among the assembled crowd, ordering that Leora's handprint be permanently preserved upon the war drum, rather than requiring renewal before each battle. Skilled artisans carefully treated the drum's surface to ensure her mark remained visible indefinitely, transforming what had begun as a private, often misunderstood ritual into a lasting symbol recognized throughout the kingdom. This mark, Draven announced to the gathered crowd, represents protection born not from mere superstition, but from genuine love and sacrifice, carried forward through someone whose silence never diminished the strength of her devotion. Let it stand as a reminder that true strength often speaks through action rather than words alone. The crowd's response carried genuine warmth, soldiers and villagers alike recognizing in this gesture an acknowledgement of values they had come to respect through Leora's demonstrated character, rather than empty ceremony alone. In the months that followed, Leora's role within Velmor's court continued expanding naturally. Her healing knowledge eventually formalized into training programs that improved treatment across the kingdom's military forces. Her quiet counsel increasingly sought by Draven on matters requiring the patient wisdom she had always possessed, despite her inability to voice it through spoken word. Margaret continued mentoring her, though increasingly as colleague rather than simply teacher, proud of how far her quiet student had traveled from the frightened child first brought into her care. Draven, meanwhile, found his own understanding of leadership transformed through their partnership, learning patience and careful observation skills that complemented the more direct authority he had relied upon throughout his earlier years as king. Their combined signing vocabulary grew extensive enough that formal translators became largely unnecessary, their private language a testament to the genuine effort both had invested in truly understanding each other beyond surface assumptions. Though raids along Velmor's borders occasionally continued testing the kingdom's defenses, each battle now carried forward not just strategic preparation, but the quiet reassurance of Leora's permanent mark upon the war drum, a symbol that had transformed from mysterious mystery into celebrated tradition throughout the kingdom's ranks. On quiet evenings when duties allowed, Draven and Leora often returned together to the small shrine hidden among the trees where her family's memory remained honored, adding new stones and small tokens as the years progressed, a private ritual maintained not from necessity, but from genuine desire to honor a past that had shaped who Leora had become. While building a future together neither had imagined possible during those early days of suspicion and misunderstanding. The kingdom of Velmor continued forward under their combined guidance, stronger for having learned that true strength sometimes arrives in silence, that genuine devotion requires no grand declaration to prove its worth, and that even a king, certain of his own understanding, might discover the most valuable lessons come from those willing to teach him, one careful gesture at a time. Years later, when their eldest child, a bright-eyed girl named Elowen, grew old enough to ask about the story behind the mark still visible upon the ceremonial drum kept within the castle's great hall, Draven and Leora would tell the tale together, his voice carrying the words while her hands moved alongside him in the signs Elowen had grown up learning from infancy, a language now woven naturally into the fabric of their family, rather than something requiring separate translation. Elowen would listen with wide eyes, tracing her small fingers over the preserved handprint whenever she visited the hall, imagining her mother as a quiet, watchful presence moving unseen through a camp full of soldiers who never understood the depth of devotion behind her silent ritual. She would ask, as children often did, whether her mother had ever been frightened, approaching a king's sacred drum under cover of darkness with nothing but hope guiding her actions. Leora's answer, signed with the gentle patience she had always carried, explained that fear and hope could exist together, that courage was not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act despite it, a lesson she hoped her daughter would carry forward into whatever challenges her own life eventually presented. Draven often added his own reflection to these retellings, admitting to his daughter that he had once let anger and suspicion cloud his judgment, before finally allowing patience and genuine curiosity to guide him toward understanding. He spoke of how a single unexplained mark had ultimately taught him more about leadership, humility, and love than any lesson from his advisors or tutors during his younger years preparing for the throne. As the kingdom of Velmor continued to flourish under their combined guidance, stories of the mute healer who had won a king's heart through quiet devotion rather than words spread beyond its borders, inspiring other kingdoms to reconsider their own assumptions about strength, value, and the many forms genuine courage could take. Traveling storytellers carried fragments of their tale to distant villages, each retelling slightly different, yet always centered on the same essential truth that had defined their journey from suspicion to partnership. Margaret lived long enough to see Leora's healing methods formally recorded and taught to new generations of healers throughout Velmor. her family's forgotten remedies finally given proper place within the kingdom's medical traditions rather than remaining hidden fragments passed only through private memory. She often remarked in her later years that watching Leora's quiet strength transform an entire kingdom's understanding of worth and devotion remained the proudest accomplishment of her own long life spent tending to others. Callum, who had stood beside Draven through every uncertain step of that early journey, eventually retired from active military command, though he remained a trusted advisor and frequent visitor to the castle, always greeted warmly by both Draven and Leora whenever he returned to share stories of old campaigns alongside newer tales of the kingdom's continued peace. Even Lord Harwick, whose objections had once threatened to complicate their partnership, gradually softened his stance as years passed and Velmore's prosperity under their combined leadership became impossible to dispute. Though he never fully abandoned his belief in traditional noble alliances, he came to acknowledge, if reluctantly, that Leora's contribution to the kingdom's stability and strength had proven far greater than any political marriage he might have once arranged. The small shrine hidden among the trees near what had once been their war camp remained a place of quiet significance throughout their years together, visited whenever duties allowed, its collection of stones and carved figures growing steadily as new memories joined those honoring Leora's lost family. It became, in time, a place their children learned to visit as well, understanding through their parents' example that honoring the past, even painful parts of it, could coexist alongside building a hopeful and meaningful future. Whatever battles Velmore faced in the years that followed, whether against external threats along its borders or the more subtle challenges of governing a kingdom through changing times, Draven and Leora faced them together, their partnership built upon a foundation far sturdier than the political convenience that typically defined royal unions. It was a foundation built through patient understanding, genuine respect, and a willingness on both their parts to look beyond surface assumptions toward the deeper truths that ultimately mattered most. And so the tale of the mute Omega who marked her king's war drum before every battle became not simply a curious piece of Velmore's history, but a lasting reminder passed through generations that true partnership required neither grand declarations nor perfect communication through spoken word alone, but rather the patient, persistent effort of two people genuinely willing to understand and honor one another, no matter how different their paths to that understanding might first appear.